It was one of the greatest maritime tragedies ever, but how and why did the Titanic go from this to this? In this week's video from History Calling, we're going to take a look at the story of one of the most famous ships in history, from its birth in Belfast to its grave at the bottom of the Atlantic, with the loss of over 1,500 lives. In particular, we'll ask, why did the Titanic sink? Who were some of those who lost their lives that fateful night in 1912, and what happened to Titanic survivors after they were left floating in lifeboats in the dark and freezing Atlantic? I'll be sharing the ship's final frantic messages as her wireless operator called out to nearby boats for help, some heart-wrenching first-hand accounts of the disaster from survivors, and the story of the discovery of the wreck in 1985 and how it has subsequently been treated. As many of you know, I'm from Northern Ireland myself, where the ship was built, and so I've been able to get footage not just of the dock in which the boat was constructed and launched, but also some other locations and memorials around the country which are connected to it, some of which I think many non-locals don't even know about and certainly don't live within driving distance of. Make sure you stay throughout the video so that you don't miss any of this lesser seen material. Finally, I'll also be sharing with you how the myth that the boat was unsinkable came about and how one of my own family members was connected to it. Before we get to that though, I'm delighted to be able to thank History Hit for sponsoring this video. I've recently been watching their documentary Treason, hosted by Matthew Lewis. In this programme, Lewis examines the reasons behind and the content of the 1352 Treason Act, including what constituted treason. He then looks at some of the most famous treason trials in English history, such as those of Thomas More, Anne Boleyn, those accused of participation in the Gunpowder Plot, and Charles I. They even have a video which also looks at Titanic, this time to debunk some of the myths around it. If you're unfamiliar with History Hit, it's like Netflix, but all history. It brings you the stories that have shaped our world through an award-winning podcast network and an online history channel. You can watch hundreds of hours of original history documentaries featuring expert historians such as Dan Snow, Professor Susanna Lipscomb, and Dan Jones, and you can access them anywhere, anytime, and on any device. As well as its hundreds of expert-led programmes, History Hit adds 2 more every week. It also launches 19 new episodes weekly across 8 podcasts, including on the world's leading history podcast, Dan Snow's History Hit. To access Matthew Lewis's programme, along with the rest of History Hit's documentaries, click the link in the description box below, which will take you to their subscribe page. You can also get a fantastic 50% off your first 3 months when you select the monthly option and use the code HISTORYCALLING at checkout. Once again, thank you to History Hit for sponsoring this video. And now, let's hear more about Titanic. The story of the Titanic starts in 1907 when the White Star Line decided to create a new set of ocean liners called the Olympic class in order to compete with their rivals, the Cunard Group. The ship was not designed by Irishman Thomas Andrews, despite what is often said and shown in movies, but rather by fellow Irishman Alexander Carlisle, who was made the chief naval architect in 1889 of the Harland and Wolff shipyard in Belfast, Ireland, no Northern Ireland yet as this was pre-partition. Carlisle resigned in 1910 and Thomas Andrews took over the management of the project, but the ship had already been designed, as evidenced by the fact that the plans were approved on the 29th of July 1908. I know this will come as something of a surprise to many of you, given how widespread the misconception about the form of Andrews' involvement was, but even the memorial to him in the square of his hometown of Cumber in County Down acknowledges that he, quote, oversaw the plans for the design of the ship, and does not claim that he created them himself. Nevertheless, Andrew's story is inextricably linked to the ship, and we will be coming back to him later. According to the Royal Museum's Greenwich website, Titanic was 882.75 feet long, 92.5 feet wide, 59.6 feet deep, and had a gross tonnage of 46,329, making her the largest ocean liner in the world at the time. She had 2 sister ships, Olympic and Britannic, and once fully outfitted cost about £1.5 million or $7.5 million. These are 1912 prices, of course. Speaking of her sister ships, there are many photographs and pieces of footage which show Olympic in particular, Britannic wasn't completed until 1915, but which are claimed to be of Titanic. While I've done my best here to sift out the fake images and not present them as Titanic, it is extremely hard to tell the difference sometimes. So if an image of Olympic has slipped through and been captioned as Titanic, please forgive me. Construction of the ship began in Belfast in 1909, with her keel laid down on the very slipway you see here, which used to be part of the Harland and Wolff shipyard. Olympic was already being built in the adjacent slipway. Nowadays, these slips are directly in front of a huge silver building called Titanic Belfast. I always find it tricky to explain what this is because it's not a museum in the traditional sense in that it has almost no artifacts from the ship, but it's an excellent visitor experience that takes you through Titanic's entire history, and I always enjoy my trips there. In 1909, the ships had no names yet, but they were given yard numbers, with the soon-to-be Olympic assigned number 400 and the future Titanic becoming number 401. There is therefore a plaque at the top of the slip where the ship was constructed with this number on it. I can also tell you that as big as Titanic was, when I was actually walking down the slip where she was built, I was surprised that she wasn't wider. I think this is probably down to me being used to seeing 21st century cruise ships, however, which are much bigger. Titanic was undoubtedly huge though. This picture of one of Olympic's propellers shows a man standing down at ground level next to it, and his presence provides a good frame of reference to understand how big these boats truly were. At around midday on the 31st of May 1911, Titanic's hull was launched into the water. As per normal procedures, there was no launching ceremony, though a crowd of around 100,000 had gathered to watch. The ship could now be outfitted to make it ready for passengers and crew. This outfitting lasted nearly a year, being completed on the 31st of March 1912, and it was intended to make Titanic the last word in luxury, at least for the first-class passengers. I don't have pictures of all the interiors, but the ship included a heated swimming pool, Turkish baths, a gymnasium, an elaborate grand staircase, smoking rooms, a promenade deck, beautifully furnished staterooms, and gorgeous dining areas. It also had some new safety features, such as a double bottom and 15 watertight doors. These features have been partly responsible for the story that Titanic was proclaimed unsinkable before the disaster. In fact, the White Star Line did not advertise it as such, though it did come pretty close. A 1910 publicity brochure for Titanic and Olympic said that, as far as it is possible to do so, these two wonderful vessels are designed to be unsinkable. This claim of being almost unsinkable was further perpetuated by the Shipbuilder magazine in 1911, which had the following to say when discussing the boat's watertight door system. At any time when it may be considered advisable, the captain can, by simply moving an electric switch, instantly close the doors throughout and make the vessel practically unsinkable. With press like this, I can understand why some thought the boat was safe from disaster. We'll come back to the watertight doors in due course though, as they actually contained a fatal flaw which contributed to the sinking. Let's also pause here to consider the ship's lifeboat capacity. The US Senate inquiry into the disaster opened on the 19th of April, just 4 days after the sinking and 1 day after those rescued had made it to New York. It was just one of the inquiries held, but it had the advantage of being able to speak to survivors when their memories were still very fresh. It summed up the lifeboat facilities as follows. The Titanic was fitted with 16 sets of double-acting boat davits of modern type, capable of handling 2 or 3 boats per set of davits. The davits were thus capable of handling 48 boats, whereas the ship carried but 16 lifeboats and 4 collapsibles, fulfilling all the requirements of the British Board of Trade. The Titanic was provided with 14 lifeboats of capacity for 65 persons each, or 910 persons, 2 emergency seaboats of capacity for 35 persons each, or 70 persons, 4 collapsible boats of capacity for 49 persons each, or 196 persons, total lifeboat capacity 1,176. There was ample lifebelt equipment for all. So Titanic took far fewer lifeboats with her than she was capable of holding, and those which were available only had room for 1,176 souls at best, despite the fact that she would carry over 2,200 people on her maiden voyage, and was able to take up to about 3,500. I'm having to give you approximate numbers here because different sources I've read give different figures. At best, only about half the occupants of the boat could ever have been saved, though in reality, for reasons which we'll come to in due course, the percentage of survivors was much lower than that. A key point here, though, is that the White Star Line was breaking no laws by sending the ship out so woefully underfitted, which I think just goes to show that while modern health and safety standards can sometimes seem a bit over the top and burdensome, it really is better to be safe than sorry. The assumption was that the ship was so perfectly designed and built that lifeboats would only ever be needed to ferry passengers over to another boat. It was not expected that the Titanic ever could or would completely founder. On the 2nd of April 1912, it was time for the ship's sea trials in Belfast Lough. She was taken out for a run, turned in circles, and some of the lifeboats were lowered over the side to check that the lowering gear was in good working order. Not all were actually put right down into the water, for as Second Officer Charles Lightoller would later recall to the Senate inquiry, there was no concern for the seaworthiness of these rafts. It's also important to note that along with the fact that these sea trials were very brief, a lot of the crew who would join the ship for its maiden voyage weren't there yet, and so many had never gone through lifeboat drills on Titanic or been made aware of exactly how much weight the boats could take. Once the sea trials were completed, the ship collected a few final items from Belfast, mainly safety equipment such as life vests, then sailed straight to Southampton, arriving on the 3rd of April. She remained at the English port for a week, picking up passengers, and bizarrely, given what would happen just 4 days later, nearly had a disaster there. When leaving on the 10th of April, the suction Titanic caused as she passed by another, much smaller boat named the SS New York, caused the latter to be torn off its moorings and come within inches of hitting Titanic. No collision occurred, however, and Titanic sailed on to an ultimately much worse fate. First, though, she went to Cherbourg, but it was an exceptionally short stay. After just 2 hours at the French port, letting some passengers leave and picking up others, she was off again, heading back to Ireland, where she arrived at Queenstown, now called Cove, at around 11:30 a.m. on the 11th of April. Again, she stayed only 2 hours, before sailing off into the Atlantic, bound for New York, where she was due to arrive on the 17th of April. She carried some of the most famous and wealthy names of the day, including 47-year-old millionaire John Jacob Astor IV and his new and scandalously young wife, Madeline, who was then just 18 years old and pregnant with their child. There was also the co-owner of Macy's department store, Isidore Straus, and his wife Ida, fashion designer Lucy Lady Duff Gordon and her husband Sir Cosmo, and wealthy socialite Margaret Brown, nowadays more often remembered as Molly Brown. Others were less famous at the time, but are better remembered now. They included the aforementioned Thomas Andrews, the ship's captain Edward Smith, and the managing director of the White Star Line, J. Bruce Ismay. For 3 days, everything went well. On the 14th of April, Titanic received ice warnings from other ships in the vicinity, including the Baltic, the Californian, and the America, with one coming in from the Californian at 9:05 p.m. that night, telling the Titanic that the Californian was stopped and surrounded by ice. Ice problems weren't new news to the wireless operator by that time, though, and he didn't pass along this message to the bridge or another from the ship Mesaba at 7:50 p.m. New York time, which I think was about 9:50 p.m. Titanic time, and which warned of, quote, much heavy pack ice and great number large icebergs, also field ice, all in Titanic's path. This oversight was partly because the messages didn't carry the prefix MSG, which would have meant they had to be acknowledged by the captain. In fact, the operator, whose name was Jack Phillips, told the Californian to shut up, as he was busy sending other messages on behalf of passengers and was trying to get them all out to Cape Race in Newfoundland before Titanic went out of range of this piece of land. It's impossible to know if passing along these messages from the Mesaba or the Californian would have made a difference. Charles Lightoller stated later that the Mesaba's message in particular would have, But while it's easy to say with hindsight that Phillips made a catastrophic error, the various inquiries firmly established that Captain Smith and his officers already knew the ship was in an icy area and hadn't slowed down, and Phillips was sitting working through a backlog of messages caused by an earlier malfunction in the wireless which had rendered it temporarily inoperable. What I will say is that I'm going to be telling you more about him shortly, and I think you'll see that despite this error, he was an incredibly brave soul who overall deserves to be remembered very well. As midnight on the 14th of April approached, the ship was travelling at high speed, though not its maximum, and there is no evidence they were rushing in order to try to get into port a day early. In fact, the British inquiry recorded that the evidence shows that he, meaning Captain Smith, was not trying to make any record passage or indeed any exceptionally quick passage. Rather, the normal practice at that time for liners using this track, meaning the crossing route Titanic was taking through the Atlantic, when in the vicinity of ice at night, had been in clear weather to keep the course, to maintain the speed, and to trust to a sharp lookout to enable them to avoid the danger. This practice, it was said, had been justified by experience, no casualties having resulted from it. The weather at this point was flat calm, and Lightoller said at the British inquiry that in his discussion with other officers on the evening of the sinking, before the impact, they had talked about the fact that this would make icebergs harder to see, because there would be little or no water breaking at the base of them. However, they felt that they would see light reflecting off any berg from at least a mile away, despite the fact that there was no moon. This overconfidence may be attributed to the fact I just mentioned, that they were doing what ships in this area had always done without incident. But of course, none had ever sailed in anything as big as Titanic, because she was brand new and the largest ship in the world, and none realised how slow she would be to turn in an emergency. Thus, notwithstanding their attempts at better vigilance, before midnight, disaster had struck. At about 11:40 p.m, when many of the passengers and crew had already retired for the night, the lookout man, Frederick Fleet, who was then in the crow's nest, sounded the warning bell 3 times and rang down to the bridge that there was an iceberg right ahead. Thanks to the calm weather, dark night, and possibly due to a lack of binoculars in the crow's nest, the berg had loomed up on Titanic with less than a minute's warning, and later experiments with Olympic estimated that it must have been seen only 500 yards ahead of the ship, given how little Titanic was able to manoeuvre in the time before impact. The officer of the watch, William Murdoch, who you can see here standing behind Captain Smith, had the ship immediately turned hard a starboard and reversed the engines, but it was too late. Titanic impacted the berg along the front of her starboard side, and the damage was immense. According to the US inquiry, practically at once, the 4-peak tank, number 1 hold, number 2 hold, number 3 hold, and forward boiler room filled with water. A 6th compartment was also breached below the waterline, but pumps were initially able to manage the water ingress. Remember those watertight bulkheads that some seem to think made the ship practically unsinkable? Well, Murdoch, to his credit, did shut them right away. However, in an effort to save money on construction, make the ship easier to handle, and free up more space for passengers, they only reached D deck at best, with many only coming up to the lower E deck. As the ship went down, the water spilled over the top of the bulkheads into the adjoining compartments, creating a domino effect, as more and more compartments filled, making the front of the ship heavier and heavier, and dragging it down by the prow. As the Senate inquiry noted, the 5 extreme forward compartments were flooded practically immediately, and under such circumstances, by reason of the non-watertight character of the deck at which the transverse bulkheads ended, the supposedly watertight compartments were not watertight, and the sinking of the vessel followed. Despite this, it may surprise you to know that the initial impact was barely felt by many on the upper decks, presumably thanks to Titanic's size and the fact that it wasn't a head-on collision. Charles Lightoller, who effectively went down with the ship by the way, but managed to then cling to an upturned life raft until plucked to safety, later recalled at the American inquiry into the disaster that it felt like a slight jar and a grinding sound, and that he had not initially believed the ship was in danger. First-class passenger Edith Russell had just returned to her stateroom on Deck A when the collision occurred. Speaking in 1957, she said she noticed a slight jar, then a second, then a third, stronger one. The ship then came to a complete stop, and when she went and looked out her window, she saw a greyish-white mass drifting past. She went up on deck and spoke to some fellow passengers who were standing there, still looking at the iceberg going by the ship. It really was that big. After that, she and the others played snowballs with some pieces of ice which had landed on the deck. She asked an officer if there was any danger, and when he said no, she went back to bed. It didn't take long, however, for the crew on board and the likes of Bruce Ismay and Thomas Andrews to realise just how dire the situation truly was. Ismay was awakened in his room by the bump, so some people seem to have felt it more than others. It might have depended on where one's cabin was. He was in suite B52, and he went straight to the bridge where he spoke to Captain Smith, who told him that the ship was seriously damaged. 3 things now began to happen at once. Titanic started issuing frantic distress signals over the wireless, it sent up flares to try to attract the attention of nearby boats, and it began launching its meagre quota of lifeboats. The distress signals make for heartbreaking reading. I can't give you everything that passed between the Titanic and the ships which were communicating with her and each other regarding her situation, but I found a full transcript on YouTube, complete with Morse code sounds, which I'll leave linked below for you. Here are some of the key messages sent by Jack Phillips, Titanic's wireless operator. And just so you know, the now familiar SOS stands for Save Our Souls and was still quite a new distress signal in 1912, and Titanic therefore sent out a mixture of it and the older CQD, which stands for General Signal Distress or Come Quick Distress. I've seen both meanings given online. 12:15 a.m. Titanic to anyone who could hear them. CQD, this is Titanic, position 41.44 north, 50.24 west. The Frankfurt and Mount Temple asked what the matter was, and Phillips responded to Mount Temple, "Cannot read you, old man, but hear my position, 41.46 north, 50.24 west. Come at once, have struck a berg." There then followed a flurry of messages from different ships and even from land, alerting everyone possible to Titanic's situation. At 12:25 a.m. came a message from the Carpathia to Titanic saying, "Do you know that Cape Cod is sending a batch of messages for you?" Titanic replied, "Come at once, we have struck a berg. It's a CQD, old man. Position 41.46 north, 50.14 west. Carpathia messaged back, "Shall I tell my captain? Do you require assistance?" Titanic to Carpathia, "Yes, come quick." Titanic then put out a corrected position of 41.46 north, 50.14 west. The Burma got in touch to confirm this position and was told by Phillips, after restating the new position, "Require immediate assistance. We have collision with an iceberg, sinking, can hear nothing for noise of steam." I think this little detail about the steam noise that was making it difficult for the operator to hear what he was doing is very touching. It gives you an insight into how frantic the situation on board was becoming, as Phillips fought to get help for his stricken vessel. It's a message he repeated several more times to other ships, presumably to make them understand why he might not be responding to their queries. At 12:34 a.m, Carpathia told Titanic, "Old man, we are 58 miles off." Titanic responded, "All right." Titanic's sister ship Olympic, which was 500 miles away, heard the distress calls too and tried to contact her, but Titanic couldn't hear them, as Phillips again explained to Carpathia, because of the, quote, "rush of air and noise of steam." Bear in mind that signals which were geographically closer were louder and therefore easier to pick up, so Olympic will have sounded fainter than Carpathia. At 12:40 a.m, Carpathia told Titanic, "Putting about and heading for you. Expect to arrive in 4 hours. The message was received with a "Thanks, old man." The situation was getting more dire by the minute. At 12:45 a.m, Titanic put out another general distress call saying, "CQD SOS, this is Titanic. We have struck iceberg, sinking fast. Come to our assistance." Phillips also tried to contact the relatively nearby Californian, but got no response, which I'll explain more about later. Carpathia stayed in touch throughout, telling Titanic at 1:05 a.m, "We are coming your way, coming at full speed, doing 15 knots. 5 minutes later, Titanic told Olympic, "We are in collision with berg, sinking head down." Every ship in the vicinity, apart from the Californian, was now making for Titanic, but most were woefully far away. The Burma was 243 miles off at 1:15 a.m. The Virginian was 170 miles north at 1:20 a.m. At 1:27, Titanic told Olympic, which still didn't seem to grasp the severity of the situation, as its operator was asking if Titanic was steering south to meet them, that far from being able to continue sailing, "We are putting the women off in the boats." 3 minutes later, an even more desperate message was sent to anyone who could hear it. "We are putting the women off in the boats. We are putting passengers off in small boats. Women and children in boats. Cannot last much longer. Losing power." Olympic checked with Titanic what their weather was like. Clear and calm, came the response. Then at 1:35 a.m, the frantic message, "This is Titanic. Engine room getting flooded. Engine room getting flooded." The Frankfurt apparently hoped that rescuers might have made it by that time, asking, "Are there any boats around you already?" But the response made it clear there weren't, for Titanic answered, "CQD SOS, CQD SOS, CQD SOS, engine room flooded, CQD SOS, CQD SOS." The Baltic and the Olympic both hurried to reassure Titanic that they were coming, but it must have been obvious by then that they would be too late. At 1:45 a.m, Titanic told Carpathia, "Come as quickly as possible, old man, the engine room is filling up to the boilers." At 1:48 a.m, Titanic repeated the plea to Carpathia, "Come as quickly as possible, old man, CQD SOS, CQD SOS, 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 CQD. The Frankfurt inexplicably butted in at 1:50 a.m. to ask, "What is the matter with you?" even though it was obvious by then, and received an understandably exasperated response from Titanic, calling their operator a fool and telling him to keep out. At 2 a.m, Phillips was still working tirelessly at his post, sending out "CQD, CQD, this is Titanic." At 2:10 a.m. came "CQD, Titanic, we are sinking fast, passengers are being put into boats, Titanic, SOS, SOS, CQD, CQD, Titanic." At 2:17 a.m, 3 minutes before the end, the Virginian heard a weak signal from Titanic, which read CQ, but the D at the end never came. Titanic finally lost all power, and her wireless operator, Jack Phillips, who had just turned 25 4 days earlier, went down with the ship. His assistant, Harold Bride, survived, and spoke afterwards of Phillips' outstanding bravery right to the end. Despite the fact that Captain Smith had come at about 1:50 a.m, just before the Frankfurt's annoying message, and told them that they could leave and that it was every man for himself, they only left minutes before the ship's final plunge, and Bride lost sight of Phillips on the deck. Phillips' messages give us some idea what was happening on the rest of the ship during this time, but survivors' accounts have helped to build up a much more detailed picture than the distress signals alone provide. Quartermaster George Rowe was on duty on deck when the collision happened and felt a jar and saw the iceberg gliding by. Only when he saw a lifeboat being launched, though, did he contact the bridge to ask if they knew that was happening. They said yes and told him to get the distress rockets, then start firing them every 5 or 6 minutes, which he duly did. By that time, the launching of lifeboats was properly underway, but it had been very slow to get going, with the first only leaving Titanic at 12:45 a.m, over an hour after the collision. We've already seen that she had nowhere near enough for the more than 2,200 people she carried, but though there was room for 1,176 souls, in fact only 706 were saved. Again, I saw different numbers of boat places and survivors given whilst researching this, with the figures sometimes slightly higher or lower, but these figures come from the official Senate inquiry. The reasons were that some of the lifeboats which were available couldn't be launched easily due to the angle the ship was at, and those that weren't even filled, needlessly condemning hundreds of additional people to a watery grave. Eva Hart, who was 7 years old at the time, explained in a 1993 interview why this was. Her father had had the foresight to get her and her mother up to the boat deck as soon as he felt the bump, and she recalled that the lifeboats, quote, "weren't launched very quickly because at first no one thought anything was going to happen. But my father went away and spoke to an officer, and he said they are going to launch the lifeboats, but you'll all be back in time for breakfast." Eva and her mother got into the lifeboat and left. Her father died on the ship. Once they were down on the water, she heard the terror of the people still aboard when they arrived on deck and saw that all the lifeboats were gone. But there had been no such panic at the time she left because not that many people were outside yet. I'd like to add to this that the crew's lack of lifeboat training on the Titanic also played a role, for as I mentioned earlier, many of them hadn't been present for the sea trials and didn't know for sure how much weight the boats could take or how best to launch them. Indeed, the Senate inquiry noted the general confusion around the filling and dispatching of the lifeboats. The women and children were always preferred above men. About 32% of those on board survived. 380 were women and children, 323 were men, assuming we accept the figure of 703 survivors, which I know is slightly different to the 706 I gave a moment ago, but as I said, these figures are disputed and I kept getting different stats in different sources, which was really frustrating. As a percentage of their individual group, first-class passengers were far more likely to survive than third, in part because third-class passengers were in some cases obstructed from reaching the boat deck as their tickets didn't allow them access to that area of the ship. Many of those famous names I told you of earlier didn't make it. Isidor Strauss refused to even contemplate getting into a lifeboat when there were still women and children on board, and his wife Ida refused to leave him, saying, "I will not be separated from my husband. As we have lived, so will we die, together." They were last seen on deck in each other's arms. His body was recovered, hers was not. John Jacob Astor put his pregnant wife on a lifeboat, then went down with the ship. His battered body was found a week later. Madeline later gave birth to a son and got remarried and divorced twice. Another millionaire on board was Benjamin Guggenheim. He put his mistress and her maid on a lifeboat, then he and his valet went and dressed in their best clothes, with Guggenheim heard to say, "We've dressed up in our best and are prepared to go down like gentlemen." This they duly did, their bodies lost forever. Thomas Andrews died in the disaster too, though accounts of his last movements vary. One man said he saw him in the first-class smoking room at 2:05 a.m., unresponsive and staring at a painting. Another source says he was on the boat deck at almost the exact same time, throwing deck chairs into the water for people to use as flotation devices. A third says he was with Captain Smith on the bridge minutes before the end and that they jumped into the water together. He is remembered here in Northern Ireland with great affection and pride, and as well as the memorial I showed you earlier in his hometown of Cumber, a memorial hall was also built there which was given his name and which is now a primary school. Captain Smith died along with most of his crew, and just as with Andrews, there are numerous reports of how exactly he expired, with some saying he was last seen in the wheelhouse and others that he was seen alive in the water. It is now impossible to ascertain what the truth was. The ship's band famously played on deck almost to the last to try to calm the passengers, and none of the players survived. Pieces they are reported to have performed include Autumn and Nearer My God to Thee. At 2:05 a.m, the last of the lifeboats left Titanic, which now had just 15 minutes left. Bruce Ismay did make it onto a boat, and his reputation was trashed by those claiming all sorts of things, including that he had dressed up like a woman in order to obtain a space. In actual fact, as the British inquiry said, Mr. Ismay, after rendering assistance to many passengers, found Sea Collapsible, the last boat on the starboard side, actually being lowered. No other people were there at the time. There was room for him, and he jumped in. Had he not jumped in, he would merely have added one more life, namely his own, to the number of those lost. Ismay didn't take a space that anyone else was going to get, and his reputation deserves to be restored. In fact, the lady I mentioned earlier to you, Edith Russell, was one of those he helped into a boat, something she recalled in interviews for many years. As the ship went down by the prow, the entire back end, the stern section, was lifted out of the water, exposing the propellers. For 73 years, however, there was fierce debate about what happened next. Some said they had seen the ship break in half before it sank, with the stern section falling back level before being pulled nearly vertical again, then sinking at 2:20 a.m. Others swore it stayed in one piece and attributed the extremely loud noise they heard to the boilers leaving their beds and crashing down onto or through the bulkheads, as the British inquiry put it. Its compilers had opted to believe the testimony of Second Officer Lightoller, which I have no doubt was given in good faith, that the ship remained in one piece. He was already in the water, sometimes under the water in fact, hypothermic and fighting for his life when the crucial moment came, and those who were a little further back from the ship and could see it as a whole had very different recollections in some cases. Lookout George Simmons, who was on Lifeboat 1, told the British inquiry upon being asked if he had seen the stern right itself, "It righted itself without the bow. In my estimation, she must have broken in half." Eva Hart, despite her youth at the time of the sinking, never wavered in agreeing, stating in 1993 that, "I didn't close my eyes at all. I saw that ship sink and I saw that ship break in half." There were now approximately 1,500 people in the freezing Atlantic, dying of hypothermia, shock-induced heart attacks and drowning. And in Margaret, or Molly Brown's lifeboat, an argument broke out as she insisted that they go back for survivors, but was refused on the basis that they would be swamped and all die as well, which may actually have been true. If you see my video on the White Ship disaster of 1120, which killed Henry I's only legitimate son, the prince had successfully left the main ship on a lifeboat, only to order his soldiers to take him back when he heard his half-sister screaming for help. They were swamped by drowning passengers, and all were lost. The Senate inquiry into the Titanic disaster stated that only Lifeboat 14 went back for survivors in the water, rescuing 4, one of whom subsequently died in the boat. Lightoller and the few men who were still with him on their upturned lifeboat, and some who had survived the initial disaster had already slipped off it and died, were also collected. The second officer would later say that the wireless operator Jack Phillips had been there for a time before dying of the cold, but this was disputed by others, and it seems it was actually Phillips' assistant Harold Bride whom Lightoller spoke to, with Lightoller himself giving conflicting accounts over the years of exactly who was there. Again, I think we need to be generous here and consider that they were in the pitch black of the ocean and Lightoller was in pretty bad shape after all he'd been through, so some mistakes are inevitable. Now, all the survivors could do was wait. Finally, Carpathia arrived at 4:10 a.m. She spent the next 4 hours collecting survivors, only ceasing at 8:15 when the last lifeboat, number 12, was collected. This rescue procedure was an ordeal in itself and was vividly recalled by Eva Hart, who said, "The rescue of people from lifeboats in mid-ocean is quite a terrifying thing. These little boats, shall we say, draw up alongside, for want of a better expression, to what looks like an enormous vessel. And then how do you get on board? You don't have a gangplank like you do when you're ashore. And so they opened a sort of hatch in the side of the ship where the luggage used to be laid, and they threw down rope ladders, and people like my mother and other grown-ups had to climb up in mid-ocean, up a swaying rope ladder, which she said was the most terrifying thing. A sailor behind, sort of holding on. And then what can the children do? We couldn't climb up a rope ladder. So they got these big luggage nets, and the mesh is very wide apart, and the children would have slipped through it, the small children. So each child was put in a sack, and I remember being petrified when I was put in that sack. And the sack full of these children were put into these huge nets, and quite safely, of course, hauled aboard." When all the survivors were collected, Carpathia headed for New York, with the Titanic's women, recalled Eva, wandering the ship, desperately looking for any sign of their husbands, but finding none. Carpathia arrived at Pier 54 in the city at 9:30 p.m. on the 18th of April, and as I told you earlier, the Senate inquiry I've been quoting to you opened the very next day, with Mr. Ismay and Commander Lightoller among those called. Also called were the crew of another ship which we've already heard of, the Californian, and much has been made then and now of the inactions of her crew. Her wireless operator had gone to bed shortly before the distress signals began to go out, and despite many on board seeing Titanic's flares, they inexplicably did nothing beyond trying to communicate in Morse code using a lamp. They didn't wake the operator to have him communicate with other vessels and find out what the matter was until 3:30 a.m. The original Senate inquiry was absolutely damning in its conclusions about these actions, saying that the Californian was nearer to the disaster than the 19 miles they claimed. The inquiry found that the crew saw Titanic's lights and distress flares, could have and should have helped, and inexplicably did nothing. They felt that had the Californian acted differently, they could have saved most, if not all, of the Titanic's crew and passengers. In 1992, however, another report found that while the ship certainly should have paid much greater attention to the distress flares, found out why they were being fired, and then headed for Titanic, in actual fact, given the distance involved and the time it would have taken them to get up to full speed, remember they'd been completely stopped by ice earlier in the evening, they would have only arrived at about the same time as Carpathia to assist with picking up survivors. They could not have made it in time to save additional passengers, and when they did discover what had happened, they headed straight for the scene to offer assistance. This assumes, of course, that the distance of 19 miles was accurate, and I'll leave it to you to decide whether you believe that to be true or not. Many who were on the Titanic, including Eva Hart and Edith Russell, swore blind that they were far closer, and I can certainly see why the crew of the Californian might have changed the details of their location once they realised the dreadful error they'd made. No criminal charges were ever brought against her captain for what occurred. Back on land, news of the disaster began to trickle out, but early reports were often hopelessly inaccurate, assuming that most of those on board were fine, although the report you see here was actually pretty good. People gathered at the White Star Line's offices desperate for news of their loved ones, and back in Belfast, which Titanic had left less than a fortnight earlier, the feeling was bleak. I promised I would tell you how one of my own family members was involved with the ship, and the person in question was my great-great-grandfather, who was one of the riveters at Harland and Wolff who helped to build the boat. He died decades before I was born, but one of his daughters, not my great-grandmother, but one of her sisters, lived into her 90s and was still around when I was a little girl. She said that she remembered the newspaper boys in Belfast the day after the sinking yelling out, "Titanic sunk, Titanic sunk," and her father crying when he heard the news. Not just because he helped to build the ship and because it was a tragic event, but because he'll have known some of the crew on board it who were from Belfast and who never came home. As well as the Titanic Belfast Centre I mentioned earlier and the memorials to Thomas Andrews, the ship and those who died on it are remembered in many other ways around the country, and particularly in Belfast. There are multiple murals to the disaster, one of which you see here, as well as this memorial to the shipbuilders who helped to put her together, and this one at Belfast City Hall, inscribed with the names of the dead. Titanic is one of those things we're both very proud of, because she truly was a shipbuilding marvel, and very sad about at the same time. Of the 1,500 people who went into the water on the 15th of April, only around a fifth were recovered. According to the Maritime Museum in Nova Scotia, 337 bodies were found, 306 of them by a ship called the Mackay Bennett. Of these, 150 were buried in Halifax, some anonymously, and 119 were buried at sea, either due to the level of decomposition they had gone through, which made them unidentifiable, or in some cases because the Mackay Bennett ran out of embalming materials to deal with any more corpses, and unembalmed bodies were not allowed to be brought on shore. The remaining 59 recovered were repatriated to relatives for burial, including the body of John Jacob Astor, whose funeral you see here. When all the funerals and inquiries were done, Titanic moved into the history books and onto the silver screen. The very first movie made about the disaster came out just 29 days after it occurred and starred silent movie actress Dorothy Gibson, who had been on board the ship. She helped to write the screenplay, which told a fictionalized version of her own story and even appeared in the film wearing the very clothes she had escaped the ship in. That movie is now long lost, save a few still images, and it was the film A Night to Remember, starring Kenneth Moore, which was released in 1958, which brought the tragedy to a new generation. There were hopes of finding the wreck for many decades, but it was only in 1985, when technology had become sufficiently advanced to allow deep ocean search and dive missions, especially unmanned ones, that she was finally located, about 13 miles away from the last coordinates given by her crew. This might be due to the ship drifting after the collision. She lies about 350 nautical miles from Newfoundland and 2.5 miles deep, which is 12,500 feet or 3,800 metres. Now, finally, those who had claimed that the ship had split in two were vindicated, for its prow and stern were found about a third of a mile apart in a huge debris field. This field was in fact crucial in locating her, as Robert Ballard, one of the team who found her, has said, noting that following the debris was like following deer prints in the snow in order to find the deer. Some of the most poignant items in this field, to me at least, are the matching pairs of shoes lying together, showing where a victim's body landed on the ocean floor before decomposing. The prow was surprisingly recognisable, the stern a mangled lump. The wreck has been visited many times in the years since, and the footage I'm showing you here comes from a 2004 expedition. It has continued to deteriorate, as you might expect, and eventually there will be almost nothing left. However, this damage has been exacerbated by the many submarines which have landed on it in order to study it and remove items from it. This is something Robert Ballard has also discussed and criticised, as the wreck can be studied using remote-operated vehicles which allow one to hover over the ship without touching it. So, why did the Titanic sink, and why were so many lives lost? Well, as with most major disasters, it wasn't all down to one thing. There were problems with the ship all the way back to the design phase, when the watertight bulkheads were not made to go above D-deck at best. Then there was the legal but disastrous decision to not outfit her with enough lifeboats to carry all on board. The time of year she sailed in made the voyage more prone to encountering icebergs, and iceberg warnings from other ships were either not delivered to the bridge or not heeded. There was an overconfidence amongst the crew that anything big enough to threaten the ship would be seen in time to manoeuvre around it, and this led them to continue to travel at high speed through an ice field despite it being a moonless and very calm night. Of course, the main reason for the sinking and the loss of life was the collision with the berg, but even after this had occurred, the death toll was exacerbated by misplaced confidence amongst all on board about the ship's inability to sink, which made many reluctant to get onto a lifeboat even if they had the chance. The passengers were not told about the severity of the situation, which made it even less likely that they would abandon ship, and it was over an hour before the first lifeboat was launched, and the lifeboats that were dispatched were often woefully underfilled, in part thanks to the crew's uncertainty about how best to handle them. Furthermore, it was a struggle to lower some, and one collapsible was even thrown into the ocean by Lightoller and others, and eventually used despite being upside down. The nearby Californian, which may well have been close enough at the time of the disaster to get there before the ship's final plunge, had only one wireless operator who went to bed minutes before the disaster occurred, and the Californian then sat and watched Titanic's distress flares and did practically nothing beyond signal at them with a lamp and watch as the two ships drifted slowly apart. Had any one of these factors not been in place, the worst of the disaster, if not the whole thing, might have been averted. I hope you found this account of the Titanic interesting. If you want more from History Calling, do remember to like the video and subscribe to the channel with notifications switched on so that YouTube lets you know when I upload. You can also find links to my social media and Patreon sites in the description box below, along with other links to some sources I used in this video, including several fascinating interviews with survivors. Let me know in the comments if you think items should be removed from the Titanic or if it should be left untouched. And until next time, keep learning.